So we're here today. We're very excited because Sarah and I are having our sponsor on, and he is a fellow adoptee. We met through some mutual friends. He had been listening to our podcast, and it was kind of serendipitous how it all came together. So from New York, we welcome Jeffrey Leventhal. Hi, Jeff.
Hi, Jeff. So excited you're here.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure being here, and thank you guys for the work that you're doing for adoptees also. So I'm glad you're here. I'm glad I'm here.
Thank you.
Yes.
Well, just tell us your story. You have we know your story, and we
Sort
don't know
of,
it.
Sort of. We don't know all of it.
So we're excited to dig in, and I think tell us how you want to do it from the beginning.
Yeah, I think the story that I have has a couple of different angles, and I think adoption has impacted my life, obviously personally, but professionally. I think some of the consequences of adoption I've turned into some positives in some ways. I certainly, now that I'm 52, looking back, I can see patterns in my life, in my relationships, in my work, that I believe are influenced from adoption. And it's more clear now to understand the impact of adoption as an older person, when I look back on my life. But I think, the thinking about adoption has hit me a few different times in life. And certainly as a little kid or a teenager, it was a much more casual thought. I was adopted. Were you adopted? I was adopted. Okay, and not much else to it. As I got into my 20s and I got on my own, and I left college, I dropped out of college, and I started to be on my own. I started to think more about my life, adoption, who I am, where do you come from, why am I here, how did I end up in this spot? And that was the first time I said, I want to look into my adoption. I want to understand more about it. And I had very, very, very little to no information. I think I had a small torn off piece of paper that was purportedly a birth document. And so I was traveling for work in my early 20s, and I actually sat next to somebody who did adoption search on a plane. And I said, oh, I was adopted. I was actually thinking about doing this. And that person, gave me their contact information in the early 90s, which was a business card, presumably back then. And I had reached out a few weeks later. And reaching out wasn't easy. It's something you think a lot about. It's something that you feel inside. Should I, could I, is this the right time? And it feels, maybe anxious, maybe scared, maybe hopeful, all combined into one feeling. But you make that phone call, and I think it takes a lot, that first phone call, to start searching. And I shared my information with that person. And I would say almost immediately, they said, I'm sorry, we can't help you. We can't solve the kind of adoption that you had. And I said, well, what do you mean? They said, well, you were adopted and you have this Mexican court involved, and you were in Florida, and we've seen some things like this in the past, and these were designed to not be solvable. Your adoption.
So when they went in, I'm sorry to interrupt. When they went in, they saw that all of this stuff you knew nothing about.
I shared information, that I had, and which was a part of a birth certificate, and a little bit of information about a court in Mexico. And that was enough for them to understand that this was not a typical adoption.
Now, what had your adopted parents told you?
Not much in regard to the mechanics or process of my adoption. And there was a convoluted story that I had heard at one point that, and again, this is to my recollection, that the people who gave me up for adoption were law school students at the University of Miami who were just too young to keep a baby, which was not true. In the unraveling all this, that maybe it sounds like a good story, but it wasn't. It wasn't a true story. Maybe that's what they had heard. Maybe that's what somebody made up, but that wasn't the true story. But Florida was mentioned. I had this Mexican court thing, and this search agency said, like, we've seen this Mexican thing before. This is most likely probably what happened to you, and we're not going to be able to solve this. And I said, okay, It was very, very disappointing. And I believe at the time, I wanted to write a letter to the state of Florida because that's where I was supposedly born. And sending a letter off to Tallahassee with information. I don't think I had a response, but I followed up. There wasn't a response, and there was no record of me being born. And it really felt like a dead end. I more or less had dropped the topic up until I had my first kid. So I went from my early to mid 20s to probably 32 years old. And when my first son was born, again, it was, wow, this is the first blood relative, that I've ever seen.
That's a common thread with adoptees, obviously, as you know.
The both of us went through that too.
Yeah.
Putting our babies in the hospital bed and not letting them go. Yeah.
Yeah. So, that kicked off, I really need to go and figure this out. I need to search more for this. And I think at some point I'd come across the 23andMe, which seemed like the only possible way to gather information. And after 5 years of 23andMe and starting with fourth and fifth cousins, I slowly built a family tree, in the reverse. Most people start with, I guess, their parents and they go outwards. I started with fourth and fifth cousins on 23andMe. It was an earlier portion in the history of that website and that business. So there weren't tons and tons of people on it yet. But every year, maybe I got a third cousin, maybe eventually maybe I found a second cousin, and I connected with one great person. And I would say 90% of the people that I had reached out to were helpful. 90+% of the people wanted to help, were curious. Oh my God, I can't believe this. 90% of people were helpful. 5% of the people maybe just didn't want to get involved, and maybe a smaller percentage, maybe they knew something and they didn't want to be helpful. But it seemed like the overwhelming majority of people wanted to be helpful, which was nice. And so I spoke to one lady, and she said, you know a little bit more about my family history than I know. Sounds like, maybe there's something here. And she went and spoke to her mom. And in talking to her mom, she had realized that her mom was one of 10 siblings, and her mom and some of them had passed by the time this conversation had happened. She was an older woman, I think early 80s, and she got on the phone with her siblings and said, this person contacted my daughter. He has a lot of information that seems accurate. Is there any way, that any of you know somebody who had a baby in our family that gave him up for adoption? And, lo and behold, one of the people on the phone call said, yes, my daughter had these circumstances way back then around the time that this seems to make sense. And, I guess that person could have held this secret or kept this secret. That person turned out to have been my grandmother. So it was good that she didn't hold on to it. And then, I don't know the time frame from that phone call with these group of siblings to when I got a phone call, but of course I was upstate New York at a fancy shooting club where you're not allowed to have your cell phone ring.
Oh, why this is happening? That's where you are.
The person that I had reached out to was calling me incessantly saying, hey, I have a phone number for you. So I finally took the call in the woods behind, some big tree. And I said to my friend, look, I gotta go. I gotta leave. I gave him the gun that we were using. And I said, I gotta leave. And I got in my car and I drove home. I did not want to make that phone call from there. One, the connection wasn't great. But two, anybody who was doing searching, I had a 12-foot whiteboard behind me anytime I made a phone call to people, because in one sentence from somebody, you can learn a lot of information. Like if somebody just simply says, my sister and I went to church. Well, there's a sister, there's a religion, like there's a lot you pick up. And so when you make calls, when you're searching, be prepared to take lots and lots of notes. Right. And so I had this 12-foot whiteboard that had kind of, a bunch of starts and stops of information. And so I wanted to make the phone call from there. So I drove the 3 hours home. I made the phone call, and I spoke to the person who was supposedly my mom. I feel like I knew it the second I heard her voice.
When was this? What year was this?
This was 2015, 2016.
Okay.
So yeah, so way forward. It took years for me to start on 23andMe and figure out this process. It was a long journey. To get this information, everything was a dead end until the DNA came along. And of course, I had the Ancestry site also, which had incredible family tree building tools. The 23 had the genetic information. Ancestry had both genetic and family tree tools. I believe I had something called GED.com, which was another DNA site. I try to use these different tools. The other thing I did.
Can I ask you, going back, how did you end up in New York? Like, what were the circumstances of your parents adopting you? Why did they adopt you?
So why, I'm not sure why they adopted me. They were very young. They were, I think 20 when they adopted me.
That is young.
You would think, that I would think that if a couple wanted to have a baby and they couldn't have one, they'd give a few more years than one to try before adoption. Adoption's a really big set of circumstances to consider, and not, obviously the most straightforward path to building a family, as all adoptees know, right? And so they good for them. They were able to conceive their own natural child 6 years later, but they adopted me when they were 20. And there were, a few, not, unscrupulous characters involved in my adoption. There was a person named Helen Tanos Hope, who had been involved in a number of black market adoptions. The story that my mom and grandma tell is that I was taken from the hospital where I was born. I wasn't put up for adoption, but I was taken. And then the court records for adoption were finalized in this Mexican court in Juarez, Mexico. Why? I got to say to myself, if somebody told you they were going to adopt a baby through Juarez, Mexico, you'd first ask, why Juarez, Mexico? Right?
Yeah.
It doesn't seem correct.
How do you have a baby there? Yeah.
So there were a number of circumstances around my adoption that I feel were nefarious at best. And then I believe there was another adoption person in the New York area that helped arrange these types of adoptions. I think you can call it adoption, you can call it, a kidnapping, you can call
Trafficking.
trafficking,
Baby broker.
To me, the lawyer that was involved on one side was indicted for cocaine trafficking. Helen Tanos Hope, I think, had this very bad black market adoption track record. And so a cast of characters showed up in the records that I had found over the years. I got to say, most recently, I was very, very fortunate to meet somebody who was involved in law enforcement in Miami at the time that my adoption happened. And, I said, how can this happen? He goes, it can't. He goes, Miami back then was actually fairly tight, fairly well run. And if this happened, it was orchestrated. And he had turned me on to a person who was knowledgeable on investigating these types of things from that era. And this person also hit some dead ends and said, look, based on everything I've learned here and the people I've spoken to, the adoption records exist. Yours don't, but the others do. And so it looks like yours just were taken away or meant not to exist. And so it looks like this was done, in these circumstances. And, he was confirming that this wasn't a straightforward adoption, right?
Yeah.
I'm reluctant to go and say, I was kidnapped and stolen. I don't know all the circumstances, but that's the story that my mom and grandmother tell, and I believe every word that they say. But
This is now your first mother, your biological mother.
Biological, yeah. And I believe, obviously, what she says in her circumstances, and she had hired a detective searching for me for 8 years after I was born. And so, how I ended up in New York was that my parents who adopted me, they lived in New York, and I guess they wanted a baby. And so somehow through this channel, they were able to get one. So
you met your birth mother on the phone.
We talked on the phone, yeah.
Yeah, so we spoke on the phone. I knew instantly from her voice, I believe, that this was my birth mother. We confirmed everything with DNA. We shared pictures, but as soon as I saw a picture that night, we had texted a picture back and forth. The resemblance was there. The voice, the sound, the circumstances, the dates, everything lined up. And we had agreed to meet, I think, in the next few days. Maybe this was a Thursday and we had met on Monday. And she lives in Florida. And obviously it was a great moment to kind of fill in these blanks and make that connection. And so that was around 2016.
So, she told you, so she had you with no intention of giving you up for adoption?
Yeah. And she was
And
15, 16-year-old range when I was born. So young, but still, wanting to keep her baby.
And she spent 8 years looking after you were born, right after.
Yes.
so you're born in a hospital. What does she tell you happened? Who took you? How did that happen?
I was with her. I went back to this, baby area where they keep you, as a newborn baby. And then, when she had come to see me again, I wasn't there. And she had left. She had, ran out of the hospital trying to find me. Where did I go? But that was it. And that's where
It's the worst
story-
nightmare of any mother.
Yeah, horrible. And so that kicked off her search for this. So in 20,
How long were you in Mexico? Like before were you just in,
Well,
you don't even know where?
been there.
No,
Yeah.
I don't understand all the circumstances from the Mexican side of this. I just, and I've got a great little side story about how I got the Mexican court papers. Shockingly, they were there. Mexico turns out to be a pretty cool country, and a lot of what we hear about Mexico, the view we get in the United States is not necessarily the view of what life is like in Mexico. And I've learned that a few times, that it is actually a great place in many, many ways. But this Juarez court showed up in my records as where I was adopted from. Again, I don't know all the circumstances, and I believe some of the circumstances are being withheld from me. And I'm not the only one. This happened quite a bit at that time frame.
Like in Miami and through.
I think
like
that there was
or
probably
something?
other cities, and I think selling babies is probably a lucrative business.
Yeah.
So
How many months were you? I guess that was my question. How many months were you just in?
I don't know all the dates and the circumstances, and there's no way of me trying to figure that. I tried to figure that, all sorts of timelines, but I don't know all the circumstances. I did find a receipt from when I was sold, presumably in the parking lot. I did actually find a piece of paper saying how much I was sold for, which I think was $2,300.
What?
Your parents paid $2,300? Your
I believe
adoptive
so. Yeah,
parents paid-
they paid somebody $2,300. I have a receipt. I have a piece of ledger paper receipt for that.
Well, we know you. They got a bargain,
Yeah. So 2016, I was able to find my mom, natural mom, and that needless to say, for anybody listening to this, on the adoptee side, was obviously a life-changing moment, and it filled in a big part of you. There's this. I think people who are adopted feel this. I don't know if you call it a hole or emptiness or missing part, but you feel this missing part inside of you that frankly needs to be filled, right? I don't think you can really live at peace without it being filled, without knowing your natural history. This is how people are built and how people are wired. Friends, family, and community actually really matter. And taking somebody out of those natural circumstances, is traumatic.
Absolutely.
The Ancestry company had genealogists that you could hire, and they were fantastic. I worked with 2 genealogists from Ancestry. It was a great service. They helped me understand DNA, and using different types of historical records to search. I was very fortunate to be able to have them help me. I had a detective who helped me track down information from the genealogist. That was a great resource, who helped me piece things together. And 2 years later, I was able to track down. 2 years after finding my mom, I was able to track down my natural father. He was in Miami, where my mom was, but had moved to the Tampa, Florida region. And I
Had
think
she told you his name?
My mom had a serious boyfriend, and they had broken up, and she had a shorter term relationship with my natural father. And she didn't remember his name. We're going back 46 years when this happened, right? So, but she had a serious boyfriend that she had dated. They had broken up, and then she maybe had dated a couple of other people, one of them my natural father. And then yes, she remembered him after connecting all the dots in the future. And my dad certainly remembered her. He was he asked me for a picture, and I showed him. He was like, wow, I had a he thought she was pretty good looking. He thought he was doing pretty well back then, and he was excited to reconnect.
Did they reconnect?
No,
No.
but, just I think maybe over email.
Yeah.
And that was good.
Did your mom have other children?
No, I'm her only child.
Wow. So she
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
pretty traumatized,
I think so.
guessing. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't think that there's a mom that gives birth to a baby that doesn't think about that baby every day.
Every day.
No matter what. And so that in of itself, a natural mother who doesn't put up their baby for adoption thinks about their baby every day. Certainly one who puts a baby up for adoption thinks and worries about their baby every day. And so yes,
And if they were stolen from you, that's
yeah, those
very
circumstances.
traumatic on top of trauma.
Yes.
Oh.
So
and your father, did he have other kids?
He did. He had two other children. He had a fantastic wife who I couldn't be more grateful for. She was supportive for me to meet him, and that was fantastic. And he had two children that are both great people that I was able to meet and get to know a little bit. John was my dad, a very, very nice guy, very affable person, somebody very, very supportive to meet. And I think when he got the first phone call, he was curious and excited. And so, I got to meet him face to face after he got that phone call. A genealogist had reached out to him, asking information and saying, that they were working with somebody who was looking for relatives. It turned out that he was the relative we were looking for. We didn't know that at the time, but things pointed to him. And it turned out that yes, well, based on his circumstances, and he didn't have any other brothers, it had to be him. And so we confirmed that also with the DNA tests, and obviously the resemblance and all the other pieces that come along, and you kind of just know, I think, as an adoptee. He was very gracious and very happy about the circumstances.
And do you still keep up with your half siblings?
We stay in touch periodically, and they're down in the Tampa market. I hope to get to know them better in the future, but we're in touch.
I have another question. So we know that you were raised Jewish, right?
Yep.
In New York. And what's your real background? Who are you?
Well, so from genetically speaking, my dad's side started out in Italy, on the northern part of Italy. Bernardi, it's an Italian name. My mom was on the Irish-German side. On a religious point of view, I believe my mom was brought up Catholic, but she's now Mormon. My dad was Christian and had a Baptist mom, and I was brought up Jewish. In one way, I have all the bases covered.
You just need to do a little Buddhism and
just don't start wearing magic underwear.
Yeah. So there's a little bit of everything out there.
Here's
and by the way, I think religion's a great thing, for many people. And I've read all the different religious doctrines that I can get out of curiosity. Maybe I pick one. But 90% of these religions are all the same, right? Yeah. Treat people well, be nice to others, live a life of honor and integrity. They're 90% the same, right? There are subtle differences, but 90% I think they're the same.
Agreed. Or I've two-part question. Well, the first is, are you still close to your mom?
Yeah. Yep. Got fantastic. She's a great person, does great work. She's got a very nurturing background in therapy, and she's built a successful career in animal-related therapy services.
Oh.
She's very, very in demand for those kind of services. And she connects very, very well with animals, loves them. And yes, we are in touch. You know, I'm very happy to be. My
That's
father, I got to know in 2018. He passed away 3 years later.
Mm.
I'm glad you met him,
Yeah,
had
we
that
spoke.
opportunity.
You know, from the time I met him, I think we spoke almost every day.
Oh,
That's so going forward. Well, okay, you came
wait,
to our
I had a
Yeah, go ahead.
question for
Yeah.
the background about going back. Did your adoptive parents, were they aware, do you, I mean, of course they probably wouldn't admit it, but this was illegal, it seems like an illegal adoption.
I believe it was illegal.
Yeah.
You know, there's probably lots of things in life that are illegal in totality, but maybe each little piece of it might not be illegal, right? And there are all sorts of ways that people rationalize, and there are circumstances that people change, and people believe what they want to believe, and some people are told certain things. You know, I kind of use the example, if you know, if I had come to you and said, "Hey, I've got this great Rolex watch. I'll sell it to you now for $1,000." You as a person need to make a character related decision there.
Mhm.
You could certainly buy it knowing it's a great deal. It's a Rolex, right? It's $1,000 and not ask any questions. You know, you probably know it's stolen and somebody's suffered because of this theft. And you know, you might buy it knowing that this was, you know, you didn't, you know, buying it yourself wasn't illegal, but probably the person who's selling you a $25,000 watch for $1,000 probably got it illegally. And you know, you probably know that, and you might be the kind of person that's okay with that.
Mhm.
Or you might be the kind of person that says, you know, I don't care how good of a deal it is, you stole that. Those were, you know, those were circumstances I don't want to be involved in. And I'm not going to buy it from you for any price, right? You know, my guess is that, you know, people wanted babies, and this was a way of getting them. And if you were willing to look the other way and compromise your morality or ethics in some ways, you know,
Mhm.
somebody can convince you that this is all okay.
Agree.
Did you have this conversation with them?
Yeah.
I don't think the conversation. No, yes, I've tried to have the conversation, but you know, that kind of a conversation really only ends one of two. Of course, we would never do something like that, or yeah, we did something bad, right? And you know, in life, you know, I've learned this in my work also. You never meet the bad person,
Mhm.
right? When everybody tells you a business story, they always tell you the story from, I was the person who got screwed. That other guy, the other person's always the bad person.
Always.
You never meet the bad person. Like nobody ever comes to you and says, well, let me tell you about my business. Let me tell you what happened. I kind of screwed over all these people. I stole the money. You never meet the bad person. You always meet the person who suffered from the bad person. You know, so nobody, you know, that's that conversation that couldn't end well
Yeah.
in some way. And I know enough now where I have a good sense of what happened, and I'm okay with that.
How was growing up with them?
And
I
I'm
mean,
not
they
going
were
to change what happened either,
No.
right.
right? Some of it is, you know, what's in the past is in the past. We can't go back to the past. We can't regain the past. Past doesn't really exist anymore. And so at some point, you know, okay, this happened, but you know, you do need to move on with your life.
That's kind of what I was going to ask you. So you came to hear, did you start listening to our podcast and coming into this, or were you already doing reading? Sort of I know the last couple of years has been really big for you, dealing with, you know, because you're involved with us, even helping other adoptees. And
Yeah. Well,
tell us about that.
I would say that, you know, maybe I'll touch on, you know, professionally, you know, I've always worked independently. I've been, you know, a entrepreneur throughout my career. I've built a couple of different technology related software businesses, New York City based. And I don't think I'm an entrepreneur by accident. I think my circumstances have influenced largely how I got to where I am today. You know, I think one realization I've had is, you know, I feel like I live in a constant state of survival. I don't know if that's unique or not to other adoptees. I'd love to hear if other people feel that way.
Me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, I think that's reflected in my work. I was building a business that I think most people would call substantial. It was a very successful technology business. We had great investors. We had a great team, very high quality people. It was a substantial, very successful technology business based in New York City. And very common, investors will say to their CEOs, who I was the founder and CEO of this company, I had started it, and we were growing very nicely, and it was a big business. That Jeff, you were never trained as a CEO. You should get a CEO coach. And I said, yeah, I probably, that's probably a good idea. We've got a couple of hundred people working at this company, and you're not born to be a CEO. You need to learn those things. And so a CEO coach was like a really good idea. Let's do it. And I had met with a great CEO coach, a lot of respect, very, very successful. And CEO coaches aren't so easy to come by. You kind of want them to be a good fit. And we were talking about business, and we were talking about work, and I had the opportunity to meet with this person. And he goes, "Hey, Jeff, I don't think you need a CEO coach. I think you need a therapist."
Yeah. And
that was like in the first meeting.
Yeah. He's like, it sounds like you're doing things pretty well at work. Sounds like, you know what you're doing here, but some of the topics you're bringing up to me sound more therapy related. And I was like, really? I need a therapist? Well, he's like, I think you need a therapist. Here's
Had you ever been to therapy in your life?
No.
No kind of therapy.
But, I went to a session as a kid. I kind of remember this. Maybe I was 10, 11, 12. And I went to this therapist office, and I guess, my adopted parents had brought me there. And after the session, I think my mom interacted with the therapist, and in the car ride home, they go, "Why did you tell this to the therapist? Why did you say that?" Like all that trust was broken down. I was like, okay, like that was the last time I thought about it. And, I kind of put therapists in the same vein as physical therapy. Like, I'm okay. I don't need to do physical therapy. Physical therapy is the greatest thing I ever did after an injury. Once I accepted that, it's actually pretty important. Therapy is one of the greatest things I did after I accepted that, yeah, maybe I do need to see a therapist. Maybe it is good, right? And so he gave me the number of therapists, and that therapist was like, very, very clear on, look, what you're thinking and what you're feeling is valid. The circumstances that you live through are, real and substantial. And, he kind of framed out a lot of what I wasn't seeing, but living with. And it was ultra helpful for me in that regard. And so that was my first foray into, this adoption stuff, and how does it affect people and relationships and work and family and just yourself, maybe even your own stress and, all of those things.
The things we don't know, right? I mean, when you peel back, you're like, oh my, you're like hitting your head against a wall in relationships and life. And
yeah. So that was eye-opening for me. After that therapy session, I said, I do have some things I want to work on. I resigned my position at my company. And actually, resignation is probably a generous word for myself. I think that it was a good time for me to part ways with the company. I think my investors thought so also, right? I think, having grown the company substantially, having been a founder at the company, but the company had different needs, and I probably had different things to address also at this point. And this was, I think, my third successful company, and it was kind of a good time to maybe pause, reflect, think about where things were, and do that. And so, in hindsight, it was very good for both of us, right? The company and me, and it was a good time for me to, start thinking about some things a little bit differently. Maybe think about this notion of survival. And I hadn't even thought about it in those words yet. Like, I'm living in this constant state of survival, and maybe making money was one way of surviving, right? But obviously, I think that there are others. But and now I think that. But it was a good time to maybe pause some of that trajectory of my career and focus on some of these more esoteric concepts in my life, personally. And so that is in fact what I did, and that dovetails with the time of finding my mom and finding my dad. And I had still stayed very involved in my work. I was on my company's board. I was an investor in other companies. I was on other company boards, but I had given up my day-to-day full-time operating role to and by the way, I also understand the luxury of being able to do that, of giving up my full-time work and just serving on boards. But it was a good time for me to think through some of these things. And Sarah, to tell you a little bit more about this, that is, somebody handed me a book. I think the first book I read on adoption was, Where the Mothers Went, or Where the Girls Went. It was about
The girls who went
it was
away.
about
Yeah.
natural mothers,
Mhm.
and it was their stories of them being sent off to have a baby and give it up for adoption. And it was a heartbreaking, very, very, very tough book to read. I mean, like page by page, it's very difficult. So
Did you feel in that, were you having like a breakdown is probably too strong a word, but like, were you feeling like you were emotionally in crisis?
no, because I think I put a lot of that stuff aside in this notion of survival. Like, okay, this is what I have to do. I've
Mhm.
got a family. My job is to support them, and I learned how to live in the circumstances that I had. I never walked around like an emotional mess, or at least I don't think so. I did have a close friend who pointed some things out to me. He's like, look, sometimes you come off a little bit like this and a little bit like that, but you know what? That could be anybody. That could be an adopted person or not adopted person. Maybe they're driven from different things. And but after the therapy stuff, it was more clear, where I had opportunity for improvement. And reading some of the adoption stuff, gave me the explanation for why some of those things were there.
Mhm.
Right. And so, I read a few different books, and fast forwarding a few books, I found in the back of one book some resources. I went online, I explored those resources. I really love to go to one of these weekend retreats with other adoptees, and meet other people who are adopted, hear how they feel about these things. I got to say that was eye-opening
Mhm.
to me. Meeting other adoptees, understanding how they think about identity, a sense of self, where they're from, that empty feeling inside. I didn't know these things existed. I didn't know these people spoke. I didn't know these books were written. I didn't know the things that were available to an adoptee up until just a few years ago. I mean, 4 or 5 years ago,
We
right?
didn't either.
Same. It's
Mm-mm.
kind of astounding when you
Yeah,
think that you bring you adopt a child, and then there's nothing talked about.
yeah. Well, if you're
That
adopted, there's this notion that you're lucky and you were
You're
chosen,
lucky.
Yeah.
right?
We came into it just a few years ago as well. We're the same.
Yeah.
It
And
is
so
very eye-opening.
I read this book. I think one was called Ithaca. One was by this lady named Anne. I Don't Look Adopted, I believe it was called.
Oh,
Um,
Anne Heffron. Yes.
Anne Heffron.
Fantastic. Very, very, great book. I actually emailed her and thanked her for the book, and very grateful for these people who've actually written these things, because, I benefited from having them. Of course, The Primal Wound. I liked also. And so in the back of one of these books, I found some resources. And I lo and behold and I'm fast forwarding some years here, but I came across a person named Joe Saul, Soll. He had a website that kind of took you through some of the books he's written, some of the content he's created, some of the videos on YouTube that he's put together. And he is, I think, assembled some of the best content out there for adoptees. He's put decades into a career of understanding adoption. He was adopted. I do think adoptees who do seek therapy would benefit from a therapist who was adopted. Doesn't have to be in all circumstances, but I believe that person, I don't think a person who wasn't adopted could really understand
Yeah, I don't think
what you feel on the inside unless you were adopted.
Yeah.
And that's also why it felt great to meet other adoptees, to go, because, you can relate to the circumstances that the natural people around you just wouldn't understand, and so I went to an adoption weekend. It was again, life, I went from meeting my mom, which was life-changing, to reading books, which were life-changing, to going to a weekend, which was life-changing. And I think, somewhere before or after that weekend, I was searching. I was like, okay, well, let me search podcasts and let me search other things out there and what other kind of content is out there that would be nice to hear. And I came across yours, and what I loved most about it was the stories of other adoptees, right? And some of the commonality amongst other adoptees, and just hearing the stories was soothing in a way. Understanding that these things are real. I'm not going to walk around life like some sorry sad sack that I was adopted and everything's bad, right? Yeah, okay, there are circumstances, they're tough, they've affected people lots of different ways. Understanding them, I think, can give you power. They can help you understand, okay, well, this is why I'm feeling this way. What do I want to do about it? How do I want to handle this? Where do I want to go for help? Where is help, right? And so there are things out there, and it is great. And your podcast, was another one of those life-changing moments to hear the stories, right? And Joe Saul's adoption weekend was fantastic. I met 4 people there that I consider good friends now, people that I can call and talk to and connect with, and hopefully be there for them. I hope all of us get together again for another weekend at some point. And so that kind of brings me up to today and meeting you guys. And I think, even maybe a year ago, I read an article about another person named Tyler who was running an adoption nonprofit called Connecting Roots. And he was helping connect people from a South American country who were taken from their family. And this sounded horrible. They would come and tell you, hey, we're sorry, your baby had passed away during birth. Meanwhile, the government or other people are out there selling babies out the back door of the hospital. These families, and this was ongoing for a long time. And this guy Tyler is taking on the work of piecing these stories back together, piecing these families back together. And so it's like, wow, it'd be great to support somebody like him. And I reached out and told him I'd be willing to support his organization, and I was very happy to do so. I believe in giving back when you can. So a part of my work, has evolved from building companies to investing in companies. I run an investment business today. It's called S12F, and that is the sponsor, I guess, of your show, or the one of the sponsors. And on there, a big part of my business today is not only do I've made these investments, but the beneficiary of a lot of my investments will go to different philanthropic efforts. I was able to meet this person, Pamela, who I think is an incredibly courageous person. She built Adoptees Connect. It's this grassroots organization that provides support in local markets led by adoptees to bring other adoptees together. I mean, what Pam has done as an individual to reach out and build this network is incredible.
It's amazing what she's built.
Amazing. And so I feel extreme gratitude to be able to support people who are doing these things, and I hope that I can support them more in the future. I hope that your show goes from reaching thousands to tens of thousands of adoptees, because I think they will all benefit from it, as I have.
Well, we do too, and we appreciate your support. It helped us go weekly, which we always get notes constantly, like, oh my gosh, this is great. Every week they can hear somebody, because you do relate to everybody's story.
Yeah.
They're not your story, but they're all similar.
Well, we all have a common thread, that we as adoptees share, that we talk about all the time on the podcast.
The other thing is that I've learned to help articulate to people who are talking about adoption or thinking about adoption another point of view on adoption.
Yeah.
Right. I do think that adoption should be avoided in all possible circumstances. I do think a baby should be kept with the mother, and if not the mother, the grandmother or the sister or the brother, or within the family under all circumstances, if you can. People like to say, but what if the mother was a drug addict that was run over? Okay, there are some circumstances where adoption is going to happen, right? But in general, what can we do to keep babies with mothers?
Well, right? The narrative has to change, because it doesn't come from adoptees. I mean, you and Sarah and I talk about this all the time. The narrative out there is not from our point of view.
Yeah.
obviously.
Well,
It's
it's
not the money.
thankfully we are getting heard now.
Yes.
You know, there was a recent article in the
Yeah.
New Yorker, which is really, I felt, legitimized our voices in a way that hasn't been done before because it's the New Yorker. But it's still, it's interesting that adoption is one of the, you know, we're such a divided place, and yet
Mhm.
that is the one thing in which people don't seem divided. Adoption is a good thing, and they don't
Yeah.
want to hear our voices.
No.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, we live in America and it is the greatest country in the world, but adoption is a business, right?
Yeah.
You know, I think a baby generates $50,000 in fees each time.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there's people willing to pay even more than that, you know,
Oh, sure.
if that's what it takes. And so it's a business, and people market adoption the way they want to market it, you know, to make it a business and keep it a business. And it'll, you know, you think about all these adoption agencies out there. How do you actually change the narrative? It's like every town and every village and every city has an adoption agency.
Yeah.
Right. And they're in business to do this. And so that's this kind of like this network out there that's almost impossible to communicate with. Right. And of course, if a parent wants a baby because their circumstances, you know, require that for, you know, to have a family, they're going to go to one of these agencies who's happy to, you know, make that happen because it's a business. One of the things I love about Pamela's organization is that, well, you know, the way she's building this network of adoptee support groups, it's almost the way adoption agencies were built. And so if
Mhm.
we've got this army of adoptees out there in every town and every village and every city, we'll have a voice in every town and every city, so that if somebody is going to adopt, they can at least hear the other point of view, at least understand what they're in for, understand that this isn't an instant family, or it's going to be a family the way you think it's going to be. Right. And
But these babies are not blank slates. Like
yeah,
they come from somewhere. They come from other people.
yeah,
You
yeah,
can't just
yeah.
make somebody into something they're not.
That's right. You know, there is something called DNA, right? And we're wired a certain way. We look a certain way. We're going to grow to a certain height, and we might be athletic or we might be artistic. Right? But it's like you've taken this baby and you say, look, that's all great, but now here's how you're going to live to fulfill our vision of a family, right?
Yeah.
And you know, that is almost an impossible equation to ever make work right. You know, I don't think that there's an adoptee that's not searching, and that doesn't mean that they are on 23andMe. I just think
Yeah.
that if they're walking through a crowd, they're looking. Could that be my brother? Could that be my sister? Could I get to
Always.
that building? I don't think there's an adoptee that's not searching. I'm sorry when I hear parents who are offended about their child searching, right? And they don't understand that it's only in their nature to search.
And then
And
they're adding to the adoptees' guilt, which I
yeah,
don't know about you, but I feel like I was born guilty. I don't know,
yeah.
It's my middle name.
guilt
You're
for
not supposed to discuss these things.
right.
It's
How
a
much
private
lovelier
matter.
would it, how much, you know, lovelier would families be if we all talked about it and were open and,
But
you
even
know,
families that are though,
yeah,
even you know, the
of
most
course.
open adoptive parents, the kids still have that hole inside
They sure
that
do.
that you
They
talked
do.
about. So
They do. So I said I was going to tell you a little bit about one of these little circumstances of how I got some records.
Yeah.
So just going back, something you said made me think of that. So I was building a new business, and we were looking for our first team members. We were looking for engineers, software engineers to hire. And we had come across this fantastic female engineer from Mexico working in Connecticut for a big company. And she had applied for one of our engineering roles. And I say that about this person because in typical startup in New York City, you wouldn't really think about a person from Mexico working on a green card for a big company in a suburb. It just doesn't fit the profile of the kind of person that might join, you know, a New York-based startup. And, you know, but this person, of course, we took the meeting, we took the interview, the person was extremely well qualified and turned out to be one of the most talented people I've ever worked with. So, you know, she had come to our company and, you know, having been from Mexico, at some point I said to her, I've got this Mexican background also. She's like, no, what are you talking about? You know, you're a white Jewish guy from Long Island. You know, I'm like, well, I am white, but I probably wasn't Jewish, and I'm not from Long Island, and I do have this Mexican thing. And I brought her the ripped off piece of paper that I had, or that had a little bit of information on it. And she goes, "Wow, I can't believe this. This is interesting." And then she had gone home, I think, during the holidays to visit her family, and she relayed the story to her parents. And her dad was intrigued by it, and he recognized, I think, the address or something in the document. And out of curiosity, he's like, "Well, let me see what else is out there." I expressed that I'd love to figure out what happened to me. This was before the 23andMe and all that kind of stuff. I'd love to figure out what happened to me. And turns out that he knew the judge name that was on the paper on this first piece of it. He's like, "Well, will you come from the Juarez area? And I know that name." And so he went to the courthouse that was in the record on the first page. And it was all in Spanish, but they read it, and they went to the courthouse. And of course, the judge was no longer there, but the judge's son was the new judge in this court. And he said, "Look, I'm looking for the rest of the records that go with this piece of paper." And we gave him some information, that would have been 1970. And, and they said, "Well, anything that we might have had was all moved to Mexico City, 30 years ago, right? It might be there." And he took it upon himself to go to Mexico City and help see if he can actually track down these records. And he gets to Mexico City, and he called his daughter, who was working in my office, and we were there. And I think we PayPal'd some money so he could pay some people an incentive to go and please go dig in the file, see if there's there. And he spent time in Mexico City and found 20 pages of records related to my
Oh my
adoption.
God.
What an amazing.
Mexico is not this place that everybody perceives it to
Oh,
be.
Mexico's wonderful.
It's amazing. I just got back from Mexico City, one of the greatest cities I've ever visited.
I was married to a man.
Cosmopolitan, great people.
Married to a man from Mexico City for 15 years. It's a wonderful. So I've been preaching this for years, because you get so many.
Yeah.
It's not the conversation that people think.
No. The Mexican people are great, and the country is, great. Wonderful. Also. You should go visit Mexico City. Your head will not get cut off. It'll be a beautiful trip.
It's wonderful.
What was in the records?
A lot more information related to the adoption, like, witnesses. By the way, 90% of it was probably just made up.
Oh.
Right. But I got a full set of records at least. And I thought it was crazy how, we hired this atypical person to join our company, and she was able, that connection was able to lead me to a full set of records in Mexico for this. I have the records. I asked another friend of mine who does speak Spanish, to help translate them. I have them, but I know a lot of the information in there wasn't accurate.
It was meant to be that she worked there. I mean,
unbelievable, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's like a crazy little circumstance. And like I said, 90+% of the people you meet in this journey want to be helpful.
Yes, for sure. I just, had my final piece, because my birth mother was also adopted, and so we didn't know who the father was, and I couldn't find anything. And somebody found on Instagram, and she's like a search angel. She's like, "I'll help you if you share your DNA with me." This was just like 2-3 weeks ago.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And she tracked down who my biological grandfather was, from Rochester, New York. So
amazing.
Yeah. So, I mean, just super helpful. She took all this time and didn't ask for anything. It's just, this is what we do to help. And cool.
It's amazing.
So I guess you don't, or you never will really know what happened once you left that little nursery in the hospital. Who took you?
I won't know what happened between the nursery and the hospital and my first moment in New York.
The parking lot.
Yeah, I won't know that. And that is news to me as of just a few weeks ago. Because like I said, I work on the board of another company, and I met this incredible fellow board member who worked in law enforcement in Miami. And he, there couldn't be a better person to help unravel this. But there is no record of me being born in the United States. There is no adoption record of me, that exists. I don't know where they are. I know that there are other adoptees who records do exist and they know they exist and they can't get them. That's one problem. But there is no record of me that can be found. And I was born in Florida because my mom was there, and but Florida has no record of me being born. And if there's somebody in Florida listening to this and can help me find the record, awesome. But I think as of a few weeks ago, we've exhausted all the resources to try to find the record.
And so no one ever held accountable or anything for this.
Yeah, right.
Do you at least know your birth date since you know your mother?
I believe it to be May 12th, but a birth date, I never really understood why I didn't care about my birthday.
That's an adoptee thing too.
I think so, right?
We don't, we dread our birthdays.
You dread it.
Yeah, I don't look forward to celebrating it because it's like, the first day of a long journey. And I try to make every day great instead of just having one day that people celebrate. Maybe every day should just be a good day.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
Have you met other people that have in your journey that maybe were from the same circumstances you from that hospital, or no?
No, I haven't met people who've unraveled a black market adoption. I know that they're out there, and I think I've seen some TV related shows around this. I think that there's one in the Carolinas where there was this, something of this nature, maybe one from Ohio. But I've seen TV documentaries on some of these topics. But that's it. No, I haven't met anybody else that's been through this.
And I'm sure your mom was easy prey being her age. And I mean,
I think that that's the start of it. I think that they see somebody vulnerable come in and they look at it as a opportunity.
It's that trafficker's mindset, period. I mean, exploit the vulnerable.
The doctor had to be involved. The nurses were most likely involved based on everything that we can figure out. That somebody in that hospital was involved.
It's disgusting.
Yeah.
Well, I hope if someone's listening, maybe, you never know.
You never know.
Yeah.
Reach out. Wow, Jeff, what a story.
Yeah. Yep, lots of stories out there. I got to say, overall, I've been, very fortunate to live a very good life. I'm grateful for lots of the things in my life. This is just a part of my life. And I know that it probably is also a big part of other people's lives. And, hopefully the same way I found resources in the books, in your podcast, in Joe Saul, I hope other people can find those resources. I hope your podcast helps people find those resources. And I hope that we can help support organizations that will continue to help adoptees as well. That's become an important part of my life's work now.
Ours too. And thank you. We're going to list those resources too. You've mentioned a lot of them and they're wonderful. Joe Saul helped another guest of ours, Carolina. So he's doing good work. It's nice to hear that,
he's doing great work. He's doing great work.
Wow.
All right. Well, we will list everything, and including your website in our show notes for everybody who wants to reach out. And thank you for doing this.
Yeah. Thank you for your work. Thanks for having me today. And thanks to all the other adoptees who shared their stories.
And we'll continue to do so.
All right.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks,
Okay.
Jeff.